rain don't fall, that's when you know you're gonna go dry. When the rain don't fall, that's when you know you're gonna go dry. And it won't do no good to be crying out loud, babe, or cursing the sky.
Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana, and I'm joined again by Paul Rubin for a part 2 of what might turn out to be a continuing series on modern monetary theory and how we should be looking at the federal government's money system and how that impacts so many parts of our life. So welcome again, Paul.
Thank you very much for having me back. It's a complicated subject, and there's a lot to discuss. As I was telling Bob earlier, this has been a kind of a deep dive for me for a couple of years, and there's still some things now after a couple of years that I'm still fuzzy on at times and have to be reminded of. So it's a complex subject. It's something that we've been misinformed about for a long time, and the first step is education, of course. So,
and I think it is true that we haven't really all figured out how the impact trickles into every different area, from family, budgeting to state and municipal.
yeah.
So I think there's still a lot to be learned, even by the experts.
Oh, definitely. We often think about science as being, a constant, not just reaffirmation, but when new evidence presents itself, you change your theory slightly. You incorporate that new evidence into account. So, yeah.
So I guess the first point we want to make, which is sort of review from part 1, which we did about a month ago, is that the federal money system in the United States is not like any other money system within the United States.
Yeah, definitely.
And we do have a slide that kind of illustrates that. We have a couple of slides, but the first one is harkens back to what Sesame Street with an electric company.
Yes.
Which of these is not like the other?
That is exactly in Stephanie Kelton's book. That's exactly the example that she uses. She was thinking about Sesame Street when she described this graphic. Exactly.
And it really is different from everything. I mean, household budgeting, city budgeting, state budgeting, corporate budgeting are all kind of similar.
Yes, so there's one of these entities that it's not like the other. The federal government is not like a state, a municipality, a corporation, or often we say that the federal budget is nothing like that of a household. It doesn't have fiscal limits. Your household, your state, your city, town, even nations that have given up their monetary sovereignty, like the European nations, they can't create their own money. They don't have the capacity to do that. And there's actually a quote from the U.S. Federal Reserve regional bank in St. Louis, the St. Louis Fed, that says it's important to remember that the government, and this is referring to the U.S. government, of course, the U.S. government differs critically from businesses as individuals as the sole manufacturer of dollars whose debt is denominated in dollars. The U.S. government can never become insolvent, i.e. unable to pay its bills. So, often the politicians, everyone from politicians to corporate leaders and that kind of stuff will fearmonger about we've only a certain amount of capacity for the government to spend. Or Obama was actually infamous for saying it. This was shortly, I think, after the financial crisis. He actually had a quote, I think this was on 60 Minutes, or maybe it was a news show, that said, the U.S. government has run out of money. We don't have any more money to spend, which is a complete lie, because whenever we have a war, whenever we need to bail out banks, whenever we need to provide corporate subsidies, there's always the money there for those things. But when it's for the public purpose, when it's for healthcare, when it's for jobs, when it's for something that would actually benefit average people, they always seem to find difficulty with the money question. How will you pay for it? It was a constant refrain that we heard in Bernie Sanders campaigns.
And I think part of the issue is that when we do our household budgeting, we are so used to thinking, oh yeah, we can't spend more than we're taking in, or we're going to be in trouble someday.
Right.
Our car might be repossessed, or our
Right.
house might be repossessed, and we'll be in trouble.
Yeah.
And the federal government just isn't like that.
No, not at all. It's eye-opening when you realize that the federal government is not fiscally limited at all. It's only limited by the amount of resources available for purchase. So if it runs out of, and it could still spend then, but what you would have is resulting is inflation. If the federal government spends specifically in areas where those resources, whether it's labor, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's raw materials, when those things are not in excess, and you'll ultimately end up bidding up the price of those real resources. So what we often say in MMT is we replace an imaginary fiscal restraint with a real resource constraint. If you have, and this, I think I mentioned this quote before from John Maynard Keynes, and he said this back in, I think it was the 30s, when we were talking about how to pay for the war, how to pay for World War II. He said, anything we can actually do, we can afford. The question is, the easiest question is always finding the money. The difficult question is, how are you going to resource that spending? So.
And wartime has actually been a case where we have always found the resources.
Yeah, that's exactly true. And it's whether it was JFK sending men to the moon, or all these giant national projects that we found incredibly important to as a public purpose, we ended up finding the money. There's an example. I don't know if we want to move to the next.
Oh yeah. So federal finances are not like finances at any other level here. However, they are not unfamiliar.
Right.
And we have a slide here. So
everyone remembers playing Monopoly. And there are some. It's not a perfect comparison. They're obviously it's a board game. It's it's not the particularly.
There are some limited resources to purchase, for example.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Definitely.
Two dozen properties total or something.
Right. Exactly. But they're in the official rules. We all remember. In the official rules, that when you break out the board game of Monopoly, before you roll the dice, before you pass go, before you pay, land on a chance and pick up the luxury tax, and you have to pay the tax. The first thing that happens before anything else, maybe after you hand out the pieces, the dog and the whatever, the first thing that you do is you pick a banker. Could be one of the players, could not be, but you pick a banker, and the banker hands out the appropriate cash to the players. So there's no other place for the money to come from other than the banker. Now, the banker in the board game is kind of a consolidated version of banks and what the authority would be, which is the government. So the first rule that we listed here is banks choose players choose the banker, and each player is given $1,500 divided as follows. Okay, so that's the first thing that happens. And the second rule is kind of an illustration of the fact that the bank in the board game kind of functions also as an authority figure. It holds all the property deals. It collects all fines, fees, and all that kind of stuff. And the final rule, which is maybe most illustrative for our discussion, is the fact that I don't know if it happened in when I played Monopoly. I don't remember if we ever had to do this, but in the official rules, it says if the bank ever runs out of money, okay, then you just take out ordinary slips of paper and start writing whatever denominations you did on the slips of paper.
So you just print more money.
Right. Well, we in MMT we often don't say we try to avoid the term printing money because it has negative connotations. But in essence, you're right. You literally in the board game you literally do. The reason we avoid the term printing money in MMT speak is because it brings up Weimar Republic and wheelbarrows of money kind of imagery, which is meant to distort the reality, but also kind of fearmonger a little bit. But yeah, yes, you literally print the money in the game. Yes.
So one subject that we touched on last time, but kind of ran out of time before talking about it, if the government can just create funds for whatever it wants to do or needs to do, why do we need taxes at all?
It's a great question, and there as a kind of corollary to that, it's one of the fundamental understandings that MMT brings to macroeconomic discussions like this is the fact that not only does the federal government not need taxes for revenue, it actually can't use them. Federal taxes, as opposed to state taxes, as opposed to municipal taxes, they delete money. If money creation by the government, if federal spending is the equivalent of money creation, which is what it does, when the Federal Reserve credits bank reserves to your bank, and your personal bank credits your personal bank account, then taxes actually remove money from the economy and essentially deletes it. They can't be used as revenue. And so in 1946, I don't know if you could bring up the next slide, but in 1946 we find that kind of the first illustration or specification of this in writing, which is Beardsley Rummel was the New York Fed chair. And he wrote a piece in American Affairs in January 1946 issue of American Affairs, and he listed why, and this was in the aftermath of the Federal Reserve and the end of fractional reserve banking and all this kind of stuff, and also the ending of the gold standard domestically, why federal taxes are obsolete. His title was Taxes, and he specifically meant federal taxes for revenue are obsolete. And so he specified kind of 4 reasons why we tax. We went over 2 of them, I think. The 2 probably less important ones actually in the first episode. Primarily, the first and foremost reason for taxation is to give value to the currency, to a currency that would otherwise, to a fiat currency that would otherwise be worthless. It's to create demand for the currency. It's to make people need the currency in order to pay, in order to extinguish their tax obligations. The state imposes a tax on its citizens or on its people, and then it demands that tax be fulfilled, be extinguished in that currency, in that U.S. dollars and U.S. dollars alone. You can't go, last month when everyone was paying their taxes, nobody paid in Bitcoin, nobody paid, at least to the federal, I know there are some very, very specific examples state-wise that have come out recently, but nobody pays their federal taxes in euros or yuan or yen or any other currency other than U.S. dollars. And so taxes, federal taxes, create that demand that you need to work for these dollars in order to extinguish your taxes, or else you'll go to jail or whatever else. So that number 1, that's most important, and that's been true really for the entirety for about 5,000 years of history of monetary systems. There are a lot of anthropologists who have gone back and studied this. David Graeber specifically has gone back and studied this question. And money is a creature of the state. It's only really ever been a creature of the state in widespread use. And taxes are the state's requirement for you to force you to work, basically. So that's number one. Number two, slightly more complicated, is that it indirectly controls inflation. So when we talk about inflation, people think about it as being a consequence of money creation. That's a fallacy that's often gotten repeated. But as we discussed earlier, it's a question of the real resources and whether. I think Professor Randall Wray used this example recently. You could print $1 quadrillion or create $1 quadrillion and send it to the moon. The money creation itself, the quantity of money itself, is not what creates the inflation. It's the spending, and specifically spending on a limited set of resources that might drive up prices. So taxes also can reduce consumer spending, restrict the private sector from bidding up the prices of whatever might be in limited resource.
And you brought up the Weimar Republic
Yes,
before, which
right.
is sort of the wheelbarrow full of cash to buy a loaf of bread.
Right.
It's like if there were enough loaves of bread, that wouldn't really be an issue.
That is exactly the case. So it's all so inflation is always a supply side issue, or almost. There is a lot of inflation that's due to, I think we may have discussed this earlier as well, of oligopolies, monopolies raising prices because they exist to maximize profit, not production or distribution. In the case of Weimar and Zimbabwe and Venezuela, these were all cases where you did have inflation, not just inflation, but hyperinflation. That was an effect. The inflation itself was a cause of the money growth, not the reverse. So in Weimar, you had Germany that had just gone through World War I. They lost millions of German workers. They had a significant amount of Rhineland, a significant portion of their industrial sector that was confiscated during the Versailles Treaty. You had these massive foreign debts that were imposed on as reparations that were imposed on Germany, that were denominated not in Deutschmarks but in French francs. And so that's the difference. I think calling back to the slide from the Federal Reserve, it specifically said all that debt is denominated in US dollars. If it were denominated in won or yen or some other currency, then we'd have a different case. And that was the case for both for Venezuela, and that was the case for Weimar Germany, and so.
Okay, so what's the next reason?
Third one, I think we talked about these two last ones, and they're important, but they're probably not quite as. Third is social control. So we think about them as sin taxes or incentivizing behavior. So smoking. The federal government wants to cut down on the public smoking, so they impose a tax on cigarettes. Or gas guzzling cars, maybe,
Right.
or incentivizing electric vehicles. I mean, we actually have this, right? So that's controlling societal behaviors is a third, and fourth is one that we often think about all the time, which is controlling wealth and income distribution, and that's really important, obviously. And it's one of the reasons why I think that we have obviously we live in a second Gilded Age, really. I mean, we have as much inequality today as we did in the early 20th century. in some ways arguably more so. But
And Connecticut is actually one of the worst states in
Yeah.
the United States for that.
definitely.
We have the poorest cities,
Yep.
Probably in the top 5 poorest, and some very wealthy ones as
Definitely.
well.
Yeah, and important to remember. I mean, again, states are not currency issuers, but they and we were talking about this just a few minutes ago before the taping. School districts are zip code funded. If you live in a relatively impoverished district, zip code, perhaps like New London, as opposed to somewhere in Fairfield, you will have less funding for your school because states and municipalities are restricted by the amount of tax revenue that they get in
Right.
they collect in order to fund whatever they need. So yeah. And we do have one of the most financially fiscally segregated states in the country. Yeah.
Yeah, and some of the taxation is very regressive, and
Yes.
even
Definitely.
some organizations like Connecticut Voices for Children, that I look at their budget stuff, they're on one level saying they need the money from the billionaires to fund things, but they're partly, I think, saying, you can have the little tax on stock transactions, and they're for behavioral, regulation and to close down the wealth gap more than just putting more money to spend
Sure.
in the state budget.
Sure. And I do think it's important to remember that there's you don't think about the term trickle down in terms of this way, but there's a trickle down effect of austerity. When the federal government refuses to spend, it falls on states to pick up the slack, and they're currency users, not issuers. So they're restricted by the amount of tax revenue, and if the states refuse to spend appropriately, then it falls on the municipalities. And successively, each lower level has less monetary sovereignty than the one above.
Right, and then if the municipalities can't or won't fund the needs, then it falls on households
And then exactly.
and individuals.
Exactly, and so we often talk about, there's really only 2 places for money to be created. It's either the federal government creating it or private debt, loans. And the difference between the federal government spending and bank money is the federal government doesn't require payment back. Banks do, and the federal government is the only place for net new money. So when you go to your bank and you ask for a loan, they may approve you or may not, but they require payment back in full plus interest.
Right.
The federal government doesn't. When it spends, it's net new money, it's positive. And we'll go, we'll talk about this hopefully in the
Yeah, I
next
think
slide.
that's the next thing.
Yes.
I think is going to be debt.
Debt, yes. So all debt by anyone is an asset to someone else. So you'll see in the graph above, the blue is the private sector. The red is the public sector, meaning federal government specifically, and the green is actually the foreign sector. So you see that this is what's called sectoral balances. They're always in balance. Whatever one entity is in debt for, the other it's an asset to someone else. So when people fearmonger about the deficit spending and the government is spending too much, what they're really saying is that you have too much in asset. The general public has too much in assets. Throughout history, we've tried. There have been, I think, 7, technically 8. I'm not sure why the second example there is often left out. But there have been 8 occasions when our federal government has spent less than it's taxed back. So, and each time has resulted in recession or depression. And some panics in the 19th century were some of the worst that we've ever seen. I think the only time that our federal debt has actually been completely paid off was during Andrew Jackson, and there was the Panic of 1837 was probably a worse depression than even the Great Depression of 1929. But when the federal government refuses to spend it, when it imposes austerity, public austerity, there's only one place for the private sector to go, where corporations, people, households, they have to turn to private banks to pay their bills, to pay their employees, to pay whatever else. And the result is inevitably is going to be a crash. There is only a certain amount of private debt that households and banks themselves can accumulate before it all blows up. And so we've seen this recursively through, and the most recent one, the 2008-2009 financial crisis, specifically, I think, in reaction to Clinton surpluses, which you see on the, I think it's actually pointed out in that graph there, where it's the only point in this graph where the blue is actually in deficit. So that means that the federal government had a surplus. If the federal government has a surplus, that necessarily means that the private sector has a deficit. It's operating in the deficit.
Wow.
And that was 2008, 2009 financial crisis, 2001 as well. We had a dot-com bubble, but there was the repeal of Glass-Steagall, removing restrictions of between commercial and other banking, public banking. So yeah, it's a very, very negative cycle that we're now kind of like, and I think we might have spoken to this as well last session. We're still dealing with the repercussions of this kind of these narratives about the dangers of federal deficit spending. And Doge, Elon Musk and Doge came along, and we're like, well, we have to get our fiscal house in order. We have to, make government more efficient. When in reality, it does enormous amounts of damage to our economy as a whole when he recklessly, cuts here and there and forces people again to turn to private bank money.
And what we're living through now is kind of chaotic because a whole department is fired and then 2 weeks later they're rehired.
Yeah.
Well,
because they saw the repercussions of it. I mean, honestly, I think that they saw not just public backlash to it, but real economic consequences to cutting so drastically. But yes.
So the next thing, it's a little off of this particular debt subject, but it's always something that people are concerned about is the Federal Reserve.
Yes, right.
And how did it start? I know there have been so many over the years calls go back to the gold standard or the silver standard,
yes,
or go crypto or
right,
whatever, to kind of push the Fed out of the picture.
Yeah.
What's the problem with the Fed?
So I mean, it's not so much a problem with the Fed, but I would argue capitalism itself. That's my opinion. There could be certainly reforms that could be done to the Federal Reserve and stuff like that, but ultimately these are all policy decisions. Whether we have a Federal Reserve is often people will harken back to like Jekyll Island and conspiracy theories about a handful of bankers coming together to create this Federal Reserve system. But what a lot of people don't understand, and we'll be covering this in a macro and cheese episode with a historian named Christopher Shaw that's coming up in a couple of weeks, who wrote a book on the history of the Federal Reserve. And it's a quasi-public private entity. So and it was a compromise that was in response to enormous financial instability that developed in the 19th century. We had all of these state chartered banks that were issuing money outside of U.S. government money. So and there an instability because a bank could go belly up, a state chartered bank could go belly up, and there wasn't FDIC insurance or anything like that at that point. There were no federal regulations about this kind of stuff, and so there's also a lot of racial discrimination. I mean, African Americans would get a $10 note from their state chartered bank, and someone as a consumer might go to a shop and say, I want to buy $10 of good with this $10 banknote that I have here, and they would say that $10 note is not worth $10 to me. It's worth $5 to me because I say so, because there was enormous amount of racial discrimination still during that period. But there's all this financial instability of these state chartered banks going belly up, and then people's life savings being either drastically diminished or completely wiped out. And so there was a lot of discussion about, okay, what do we do to fix these great instabilities? And the graphic that we had up there, they mentioned some of those panics during the 19th century. The state chartered banks, the lack of centralized regulating figure in the matter, made depressions worse. Actually, brought on some panics, and so the public had a great interest. It's strange now because we have a lot of lack of interest in the question of banking and financial stuff. There was an enormous amount of input from the public that ended up leading to a compromise between the banking industry and the public. The public wanted something that was much more, that was fully public, a fully public
Sure.
system that was fully accountable to them by elections and all this kind of stuff. And the banking industry didn't want to give up power. But ultimately, the federal government, the Federal Reserve is the central bank of the federal government. It's the government's bank. It's really what we call a quasi-public private entity. The governor's Federal Reserve Board of Governors is appointed by the President of the United States. They're approved by the Senate. They're accountable to U.S. Congress. They're for testimony. And there's daily coordination. People don't think about this either, but there's daily coordination between the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve. It couldn't operate any other way, really. But maybe most importantly, the charter itself that was written in 1913 was written by Congress. It's only by the legal framework that Congress put down that the Federal Reserve System was set up. And just as easily, if there are reforms that arguably could be made to the Federal Reserve to make it more democratic or whatnot. To make it more, to serve the public purpose more, because I don't think that it is right now. I don't think that we would say that the Federal Reserve is necessarily funding the public purpose, but it's a question of whether Congress is willing to would be willing to rewrite the charter, and so I'm
not sure I trust the current Congress with a charter rewrite.
Agreed, and that's really a central question that we have to understand is, all these questions are ones of policy decisions, but we're not going to get the policies that we want with a government, of, by, and for the oligarchy, and unfortunately that's what we have. It doesn't, no matter how much how many elections we have, it doesn't. I think the plurality of American of voting age don't vote right now because they understand that for them at least, for a lot of for them, it doesn't necessarily matter who's in control of stuff.
Yeah, I always kind of see voting as you want people in who will, who will respond to the pressure that
Yes.
is put on
Yes.
them by populist and progressive movements.
Yeah.
FDR didn't, had pressure on him.
Yes, there are enormous amounts of people don't think about this, but the New Deal was almost in some ways forced upon him by largest labor organizing in our U.S. history, arguably, by two socialist parties, a communist party,
Right.
And he relented to that pressure.
So
yeah.
you do want people in office who will relent to that kind of pressure,
Sure.
but it is limited because the initiative is not going to come from Congress or all the way down to city councils.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that history of social movements in this country has kind of been lost. That whether it was from the labor movement to women's suffrage. I mean, women didn't vote in their ability to vote. Right? That's not how it happened. We mentioned the New Deal, the Civil Rights Movement. I think a lot of the history of the Civil Rights Movement has gotten watered down to make Martin Luther King Jr. and a lot of his compatriots less revolutionary than they were. They were using non-electoral means to achieve the reforms that they ended up, achieving by legislation, but that didn't happen. Lyndon B. Johnson also, was not exactly the most anti-racist
Right.
president, and he instituted Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act and all that kind of stuff. So,
Yeah, it's a complicated situation because getting policies changed by the people who are empowered to actually, pass the bills, sign the bills, is way beyond just counting on them to do it.
Yeah, and that was kind of the points about the history of the Federal Reserve. I mean, it really took an enormous amount of organizing effort by farmers, by workers, by ordinary citizens to educate themselves, to organize, to pressure their Congress members, and force what they saw as an acceptable compromise in their view. And one point, the point I'll make about the Federal Reserve is it has this dual mandate of controlling inflation and maximizing employment. And it really only has the one tool that it has that is completely independent of Congress, of the president, is controlling interest rates. And that doesn't actually accomplish either of those goals. It's part of what's known as monetary policy, but it's really the fiscal side that could have an effect on limiting inflation and maximizing employment with a federal job guarantee or in targeted spending towards reducing inflation. Whether or not the federal government, the Federal Reserve changes interest rates is not necessarily doesn't necessarily have the effect that's a desired effect. I did want to go. I don't know if we have time.
We have some time.
Just to mention, we didn't really necessarily go back to the definition of, and this ties in to interest rates a little bit. In that definition of the national debt, a lot of people do fearmonger about the national debt. There's a number. It's $36 trillion, and it's unsustainable, and all this kind of stuff. What it's important to remember is that number, the $36 trillion number, is nothing more. It should really be called the national debt clock. Should really be called the national savings clock, because as we mentioned before, federal debt is necessarily public debt is necessarily private assets. It matters greatly, where those assets are concentrated, obviously, but wiping out the national debt would necessarily mean wiping out national savings, and it's the number itself is basically the accumulation of all the money the federal government has spent into existence and not taxed back, that's sitting in the economy and has been converted into what's known as U.S. Treasuries. So the only difference really between what's counted as the national debt, what's counted as what national treasuries are, and what's the money in your wallet is one pays interest and one doesn't. So a lot of MMTers will actually describe the national debt as the totality of the money supply. They include all cash, all reserves, all money whatsoever. They're all monetary instruments. The only difference is one pays interest and one doesn't. And the federal government pays the interest on that, quote, debt the same way that it pays for everything. It just credits accounts.
Okay, so I have some savings bonds from the U.S. Treasury.
Right.
So how do they come into existence?
So
what's the point of them?
The point is that they're the most, until maybe very, very recently, they're the most secure financial instrument you could possibly find. Everyone wants treasury bonds. China, when it does its trade with the United States and it sells us all this stuff and it gets in return U.S. dollars, it can't necessarily do anything with those U.S. dollars. It can't. It'd rather have them as U.S. Treasuries because they earn interest, and they're the safest financial instrument that exists in the world today. There's a little hiccup with the Trump administration where it seemed as though bond values were actually decreasing. I'm not sure what the result of that is going to be, but people keep treasuries because they're much more stable investment than much more stable investment than anything you could put in the stock market or cash that doesn't earn interest.
Yeah. Okay, well, I feel okay about that.
Right. Yeah.
And you did mention something about gold standard being
Yes.
one of the things that people bring up.
Yeah.
Like, why can't we do it?
Right.
Why can't we do it? Or shouldn't we do it?
We shouldn't do it. In 19, I think it was 1933, the FDR removed us from the gold standard because there were these massive programs that we needed to put in place to help our economy recover. And a gold standard or any other bimetal standard, you could have a lot of commodity standards. They're not necessarily gold, but gold and silver or whatever else. They rely on a certain amount of gold, a finite amount of gold. And you either, in order to spend more, you would either have to dig up more gold or invade some country or whatnot in order to get more of that thing that backs your currency. And so it's a self-limiting, unnecessary, kind of
ultimately
anachronism.
Unenvironmental, I would think.
Sure,
if you have
yeah.
to have gold mines or silver mines.
Yeah, and the history of fiat currency actually goes back something like 700 years to the Yuan dynasty in China. It's been around for a long time, and there's nothing inherently more unstable. There's nothing. Gold doesn't make currency more stable. It just limits the government's ability to spend. And so FDR brought us off the gold standard, stopped the convertibility of dollars into gold in 1933 for domestic purposes, and in 1971 in not just in the middle, I guess, of Vietnam War, or towards the end, Nixon fully removed us from the gold standard internationally. And the world hasn't collapsed. But if we were to institute a gold standard now, it would have enormous consequences. I mean, drastically bad consequences on our economy, where we wouldn't be able to fulfill all the obligations that our federal government set out, and should want to expand, not restrict. So, yeah, that's an important point.
Well, a hot topic right now, of course, is the Trump tariffs.
Yes.
So, what is the story with the tariffs?
Yeah. I think it's part of the narrative that taxes fund federal spending. That the government needs to find money in order to spend, or that our country's impoverished. That our country's going broke. And certainly, both Trump and I think Bernie Sanders as well, highlighted the collapse of American manufacturing, outsourcing that's been going on for decades and decades, probably about 40 years. But tariffs by themselves do nothing to bring back manufacturing. We've been outsourcing. We've been reducing our ability to manufacture goods and services for since the 1970s or so, and tariffs won't create more factories, won't create the resources, or especially we have another episode today that's coming up on China where it kind of goes into this. China has enormous amounts. They've been investing in education, investing in training, investing in high-level manufacturing. That takes an enormous amount. That takes an enormous amount of skills in order to produce those high-tech items that have kind of gone by the wayside in the United States. And you don't bring that back with the snap of a finger tariffs, and also we spoke about this already, but those tariffs they don't provide revenue to the federal government. They don't make the government able to spend more, and what they do is they're not incurred by the exporting country either. They're incurred by the importing companies that pay those their tariffs are basically taxes. They pay those taxes to the federal government, and then those corporations that are incurring those tax penalties are ultimately, this is almost uniformly true, they pass those costs on to consumers. And we've heard about this for the last couple of months right now, of where prices are concerningly starting to rise for limited goods.
It seems like such a backward approach. A long time ago, when I first ran for office, the union interviewers were asking the candidates what kind of car we drove, and they wanted to know that we had American nameplates.
Sure, of course.
And when it came to my turn, I said, well, I drive, at the time I had a Toyota Corolla.
Yeah.
It was made in Canada by union workers.
Yep.
And the reason that Toyota had moved that factory to Canada was that they didn't have to pay health care costs for their employees. They saved, at the time, $1,000 in the construction of each car based on the, being freed up in Canada from the obligation to provide employees with their health insurance.
Sure.
So there are ways we could make manufacturing
definitely
more attractive here.
Definitely.
But it's not tariffs.
It's not tariffs. And, there's a history of tariffs, being, I think, Ferris Bueller, there was a Ferris Bueller clip that was going around on the social media where he was talking about the history of tariffs crashing economy. It's and even people from Rand Paul to whoever are very insistent in the fact that tariffs are not the correct path. Yeah.
Okay, we have 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So we have one more slide. Well, we have a couple more slides, but then on going beyond electoralism, and we can't really. We've gone into it a little bit, off and on, but Our Congress doesn't represent us, huh?
Yes.
Surprise.
So this was a graphic I actually made from for a previous organization that I volunteered for, Wolfpack. We're doing campaign finance reform, and there was I think it was a 2014 study by Princeton University from two professors, researchers, Gillens and Page, and they did 20 years of legislative data. They compared it to preferences of average Americans versus elite, corporate interests or CEOs. And what they found is, and this is in the red there, the quote was, and this is, not surprising to a lot of people maybe, but illustrative. The preferences of average Americans appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy. That was over, they studied about 20 years of legislative data compared to what average Americans would want. And I think it's important to remember that I would say that we don't live in a democracy. I mean, conservatives might say, oh, of course we live in a republic, not a democracy, but we're supposed to have democratic ideals, democratic representation, and I don't think that's necessarily ever been true. I think we are founded from our inception. I think we've been a plutocracy, founded as for white landowning men originally, but I think it's really important when we start thinking about how we get to where we want to go, that we identify the problem correctly. Before we start thinking about the solutions. For me, I'm not sure that the solution is finding your favorite politician to back necessarily. For me, at least, I think as we talked about, it's educating yourself and bring that pressure to bear on those people in power.
So in the last 2 minutes, we have one more slide that just gives people more resources to find more information about this subject, and there are many of them ongoing.
Yes.
So look at that. And the very last slide I have is 2 events that are coming up in New London tomorrow morning. Well, tomorrow during the day, in the morning. The Coast Guard commencement is going to have a speaker, Kristi Noem, from the Department of Homeland Security. And there will be a group of, who knows, a dozen people, a few hundred people, I don't know, demonstrating at McKinley Park, adjacent to the Coast Guard Academy, on a variety of topics. It's not a top-down event, so we're not quite sure. We think immigration will be one of the topics that people are very interested in. And in the afternoon, there's going to be a community rally related to the austerity budget that was recently passed in New London. But the focus of this, I think, is to be calling on the state to fulfill its obligation to fund municipalities, because cities that have half their property off the property tax rolls, when that's really the only source of income that municipalities have in Connecticut, really, the state really should be paying the payment in lieu of taxes and the education cost sharing that the statutes require them to, but are not always in the budget. So
that sounds fantastic, though.
Yeah, so 2 things that are sort of on the subject tomorrow. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you so much, Rana, for having me back.
And if you want to come back in a month or so and something else is going on that makes it a hot topic. Money is always a hot topic. And
more so now, hopefully. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you again, and we'll see you all next week too.
Don't